Heading into the Ravens war room with 2 weeks to go before the draft. Had some losses in free agency, but also added a couple pieces, including wide receiver Sammy Watkins and offensive guard Kevin Zeitler. Still a lot of work to do. They need to get Lamar Jackson some more weapons and need to replace a couple of pass rushers. They lost Yannick Ngakoue and Matt Judon. Also, Mark Ingram and wide receiver Willie Snead. All right, let's bring in our experts. I'm Chris Hassel, joined by Danny Cannell and Bryant McFadden. And let's start with free agency before we head into the draft, guys. My take here is I feel like the losses are more important than the gains so far. Bryant, how big a deal is it that they lost both Ngakoue and Judon in free agency?
It's a big deal. Big deal, especially Yannick Ngakoue. He's still young in his career. I think the best years are yet to come for him. And remember, they traded for his services when he was with the Minnesota Vikings. So losing him was a big surprise for me. I felt like they would lose Matt Judon, and they lost him. But I didn't think they would lose both pass rushers from last year. But one thing I can say about the Baltimore Ravens, they've done a phenomenal job in being able to continue to add key additions to the defensive side, specifically speaking, the edge rushing position. So that's not a big position of concern for me when it comes to getting better, because recent history tells all of us when it comes to hitting on the edge rushers, they do a real good job in hitting on them.
Yeah, B-Mac, I think you bring up some good points too, but I think from the free agency period, it just left me wanting a little bit more. I think it was big that they added an addition to the offensive line in Zeitler, but this was a team that I felt was primed to be somebody who took a swing at a big name free agent in the wide receiver market. They end up going with Sammy Watkins, who was signed later in the free agency period, and it's a nice piece. But look at what, and we're going to talk about Buffalo in a little bit, but look at what Buffalo did when they added Stephon Diggs and gave him to Josh Allen. That was a massive move that really helped Josh Allen develop as a passer. That's why I think this draft is critical, because those defensive pieces they lost are critical. But we knew that they already had a weakness at receiver that they still have to address. Sammy Watkins cannot be the answer for Lamar Jackson's deep threat, for his go-to guy. It's a nice piece, but I still think that's what makes this draft critical for an organization, as you mentioned, does a really good job drafting, recognizing talent, developing the talent. But I think it means even more because the free agency period, and granted, some of this too is because they're saving some cap space because they want to, give Lamar Jackson a long-term deal here eventually. But I just felt like I wanted a little bit more from this Ravens team in free agency.
So Danny, heading into the draft, is their biggest need at the wide receiver position?
I don't know if it's the biggest because of where they pick. I wonder who's going to be left for them because they've had so much success picking at 27 and if he'll be there. But I do think it is a need, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But I think edge rusher is a spot. I still think interior offensive line is a spot they need to address. Wide receiver, defensive line. So they've got some needs, but I don't think wide receiver can be the #1 selection at 27. Second round, I think they could find some value there and somebody could develop. That's why I'm a little bit concerned about Lamar Jackson's development, because I don't know if they're going to have that guy available. And yes, you can always get somebody in the second round that maybe blossoms, and like a DK Metcalf who dropped and dropped and dropped, and then he's proven everybody wrong, should have been a top tier first rounder. So maybe there's that type of player available for him, but I have concerns about where they're picking if it's going to be somebody that can come in and make an instant impact.
Well, for me, I don't care if the Baltimore Ravens, they're picking, their first pick is not to the 3rd or 4th round. The biggest need has to be wide receiver, and here's why. Looking at how they attacked their free agency period, they tried to go sign wide receivers, but the wide receivers they were trying to go sign said no. They offered more money to Juju Smith-Schuster, and he turned it down to go back to Pittsburgh. They offered more money to T.Y. Hilton to join their team. He turned their offer down to go back to the Colts, and he took less as well. So players that were wide receivers that were available, they were getting recruited by the Baltimore Ravens, but they all said no, so they were left to sign Sammy Watkins. And then when you look at Lamar Jackson, big time point when you look at comparing Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson. Seeing Josh Allen with Stephon Diggs, he's a better player because he has a proven number one. The Baltimore Ravens don't have a proven number one. The last wide receiver to have at least 1,000 yards in a season for Baltimore was Mike Wallace. That happened in 2016. Mark Andrews has the most receiving yards since Lamar Jackson became the starting quarterback out of any pass catcher, which is, that number is 852 receiving yards. That's okay, but Mark Andrews plays tight end. They have been dropping the ball when it comes to getting prolific, consistent wide receivers to add to their outstanding superstar in Lamar Jackson. If they want Lamar Jackson to continue to take steps in the right direction, they gotta find a way to add a potential number one wide receiver to their team because currently they don't have one.
Yeah, and to echo that and kind of jump off that, if you didn't go out and get that big wide receiver in free agency and you're not in the top 15 with a chance to get one of those top 3 or 4 pass catchers, Danny, how can you expect Lamar Jackson to take that next step?
I don't know, and that's where I think this is so critical because, again, I don't think Sammy Watkins is the answer. But Lamar Jackson does need to take that next step, and he's had excuses. I mean, he hasn't had the go-to guy. But what I would like to see is Lamar Jackson take that next step as a passer. He threw for just over 2,700 yards last year. That was 27th in the NFL. His completion percentage, 64, was 27th. Now, you kind of take that with a grain of salt because he's rushing for over 1,000 yards a season, 1,200 in his MVP season, and just over 1,000 yards this past season. But that's not a formula that can work long term. Yes, you want to take advantage of Lamar Jackson's insane athleticism, his unbelievable running ability, where he can make defenses look foolish. But you need to get it more explosive through the pass game. You need to get more, take some of that physical toll that it's taken on Lamar Jackson and do it through the air. But my concern is that the Ravens, the coaching staff, the front office, they built this offense and they're like, hey, maybe we don't have to spend on a big receiver because we've got a playmaker in our quarterback. But I just worry about how long-term that can sustain. Plus, we saw defenses adjust somewhat to Lamar Jackson. And granted, there's no adjustment you can make for his type of speed and athleticism, but they did limit his big play ability. They did sack him more than they did his MVP season. So defenses are starting to adjust. And the way to counterbalance that is to start throwing the ball downfield, opening up this offense. But with a lack of weapons, how do you do that?
Yeah, I think the best way for Lamar Jackson to take a big step, if the organization, if they're not going to help him, and what I mean when I say that, basically adding sound pieces around him, he has to go out and just improve as an individual, right? And we're talking about a quarterback that has won ball games. I mean, he has the best winning percentage right behind Money Pat Mahomes, above Drew Brees, above Tom Brady. So he's been doing a real good job with what he has, he's been forced to work with. But if he can just continue to improve as an individual, I think those steps will happen for him. So what I would tell Lamar Jackson to do, he should just camp out and live with the pass catchers he currently has on his roster. Hollywood Brown, Sammy Watkins, Boykin, all the tight ends. And these guys just need to continue to build a stronger on the field relationship because it's looking like the pieces that he currently has will be the pieces that he will have in this season. I do believe they will make some additions through the draft, but right now what we know, Sammy Watkins will be there, Boykin will be there, Hollywood Brown will be there, Mark Andrews. Camp out and live with these guys until the season starts. Get on the grass every day to establish a sound relationship with their pass catchers and vice versa, because that has to be the best recipe for Lamar Jackson to take a step in the direction we all believe he can go.
Ravens draft 27th overall, 2 weeks from tonight in the first round of the NFL draft. Our Ryan Wilson in his latest mock has them taking Wake Forest edge rusher Carlos Basham Jr. in that 27th position. Danny, what do you think they should do with that first pick?
So I'm more in line with Ryan Wilson. I can't wait to see what BMAC has because I'm concerned about who's going to be there for them at wide receiver. Now, we saw a bunch of wide receivers in the free agent season looking for more money. They thought they were going to strike it rich and didn't, so maybe somebody drops to them. But if you don't have one of those top-tier guys, I think you should wait and go in that edge rush position where you can still impact the passer. And we talked about the losses on the defensive side of the ball. I love the Boogie Basham pick from Wake Forest from Ryan Wilson. I went a little bit different. Jalen Phillips from Miami, I think would be an outstanding addition. I know BMAC loves him too. We've talked a lot about Gregory Rousseau, but Jalen Phillips might have jumped him in a lot of NFL draft scouts' minds because he did play this last season, had an incredibly productive season. And if he's not available or you go in a different direction, Joseph Asai at Texas, from Texas is another player. So I would look towards the edge, an impactful player. You are going to have to, especially if you're going to go with this mentality of we're going to run the football and we're going to play good defense, we're going to get after the quarterbacks. Well, you're going to have to go through Josh Allen and you're going to have to go through Patrick Mahomes and you're going to have to go all these other quarterbacks in the AFC where they're just throwing it all over the yard. So if you're not going to try to go toe-to-toe throwing the ball, which it doesn't seem like they want to do, then you do ball control and you get after the passer. You pressure them. So and Jalen Phillips might be the best pure speed pass rusher when you've got quarterbacks getting quicker than ever. That would be a really nice option for the Ravens to go for.
I'm going to continue to beat the dead horse, which is wide receiver. I have two names that could be available where they pick in the draft late in the first round. And that first wide receiver name is Rashard Bateman. I love his game. Minnesota Gopher, played big time football for the Gophers. You can tell he loves being a tough-minded player. He is a football player. He's done it in many different conditions, playing in the Big Ten, cold weather, nice weather. He shows up and he shows out week in and week out. And I love his red zone capability, being able to come through in the clutch in the red zone. Another wide receiver that I love as well, if Bateman is available or if he's not available, Terrence Marshall Jr. He was like the forgotten brother there 2 years ago for LSU when you talk about having Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase. But Terrence Marshall can go. He's a big-time pass catcher. In 3 years, he had 23 touchdowns. He ran a 4.38. A talented wide receiver, a short-handed wide receiver. I love his catch radius as well, and he's been taught the game the right way. I love both players, but if they're both available, they're at 27. I side more with Terrence Marshall Jr. I think his ceiling is a little higher than Bateman. I think both guys can get into your starting lineup sooner than later, and both guys have the potential to be a #1 pass catcher. And that's something we all know the Baltimore Ravens, they're currently lacking.
So Brian has him going with a wide receiver with that first-round pick. Danny, you were thinking because the top wide receivers are already off the board, you went defense first. I'm guessing, though, Danny, day 2, that you would have to pick up a wide receiver.
Yes, I think that's where you target a wide receiver if you find a guy. Now, I've got a couple for you. Elijah Moore out of Ole Miss is somebody that really burst on the scene. He's had a really productive career there, and Lane Kiffin had a field day with him in his pass-happy offense where he was lighting up SEC defense as incredibly productive receiver, one of the leading receivers in the entire country. He'd be a great fit. I'd probably rather see them go. Nico Collins is a player out of Michigan, 6'4", 215 pounds. A great specimen. The production quite wasn't there. You always hear that potential word which concerns me somewhat, but again, I mentioned a name like a DK Metcalf, a player who got knocked in the draft process. Then he comes in with a chip on his shoulder, elevates his game. And then if you want to go back to what the Ravens have become, and they want to run the football and they love tight end play, a couple of names in there, Aaron Banks in Notre Dame, Trey McKitty, a tight end out of Georgia. But those are more third-round or later type of picks if they want to still continue to build on the model that they already have in place there. So I would target the wide receiver in the second round for sure.
Well, for me, targeting a wide receiver in the first round, you got to try to hit on an edge rusher, a few offensive linemen as well in rounds 2 through 7. So when you look at my list, I got them taking a wide receiver in the first round. If Jason Oweh is available, edge rusher from Penn State, didn't have the collegiate career many thought he would have, right? 7 sacks in 3 years, but performed wonderfully in his pro day. He could be available. If he's not available, what about offensive line play? I love Lim Etchingberg, talented left tackle from Notre Dame. I think he has the versatility to play right tackle, especially with Orlando Brown wanting to be traded. You get a guy like Etchingberg who plays offensive lineman well. You can add him to the depth at the tackle position, or he potentially could play guard. But what about Robert Hensey, a true guard for Notre Dame? He's a mauler, a guy that understands the game. He's an ideal lineman when it comes to run blocking and pass pro. So if you're not able to get an interior guy, maybe pick up Robert in the mid rounds. And then Patrick Johnson, he's the wild card for me, a huge edge Russian presence. I mean, he had 10 sacks with the Green Wave last year. The thing that I love about Patrick, he fits ideally in their 3-4 scheme. He's a guy that has shown the ability to rush standing up. As a stand-up edge rusher, he's shown the ability to rush with his hand in the dirt. I think he could be a huge playmaker for their defense, especially if you're not able to address the edge rushing position in the second round.
All right, Bryant McFadden and Danny Cannell in the Ravens war room. Lamar Jackson got his first playoff win this past season, trying to take that next step. Plus 650 to win the AFC, 14-1 to win the Super Bowl in a division that's getting tougher now, with the Browns also taking that big step, winning a playoff game this past season. And up next, we're going to hit the war room for another AFC contender, Josh Allen and the Buffalo Bills. Want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis. No yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.